Hey guys, Chris here with the Good Old Gamer, and welcome to part 1 of our CPU Showdown series. So one of the important things is, who's this video series really going to be for? Well, this is for people who are shooting for 120 hertz monitor gaming. So if you're sitting there with a 60 hertz monitor, honestly, this video is not for you unless you're contemplating upgrading here in the near future. The reason why this affects people with higher refresh monitors over people shooting for a 60 hertz monitor is because you obviously are trying to achieve higher frames per second. And in all honesty, most CPUs, most modern CPUs, can handle 60 frames per second just fine. However, once you start trying to hit 100 plus frames per second constantly, most CPUs that people generally think that are good for gaming just are not up to snuff. They are just not fast enough to deliver that kind of performance on today's more demanding titles. The main reason why this is really important is it affects your future upgrades. See, back when the Core series first launched, you could just get a Core i7 and hell, you're still pretty good today. However, most people don't upgrade their CPUs and motherboards and all that very frequently. Generally, people will upgrade their video card every year to 3 years, somewhere in there, and the rest of the system usually is expected to last anywhere from 4 to 5 years. So usually 2 graphics card iterations at the very least. Sometimes even 3 or 4. This is just the way that people generally upgrade. Now, if your processor is underpowered to begin with, and you go ahead and try to upgrade to faster graphics cards down the road, you will see diminishing returns. So you'll actually end up spending money on video cards that is completely unnecessary. In an effort to demonstrate this, I have paired 3 modern GPUs ranging from the GTX 670, the GTX 970, and the brand new GTX 1070 with an older first generation Core i7 875K processor. Now, to simulate Core i5 performance, all we have to do is disable hyperthreading, as it is the same quad-core processor, just without the extra thread performance from hyperthreading. Now, on the first generation Core series, Core i5s also had 8 megabytes of cache. So for anybody saying that there's a difference because of more cache, this is not the case on the first generation Core series. So this is an exact one-to-one comparison. Specs are listed right in front of you guys, but I ran it at 4 gigahertz and I ran the CPUs at 3.5 gigahertz, as if you're not getting that great of an overclock on your first gen Core series, you might be in the mid 3s, and if you get a good overclock, you'll be somewhere around the 4 gigahertz mark. Now, if you're running a first generation Core series processor and you're not overclocking, considering you can B-clock even Core i3s, you must do that. As you will see, the more performance that you can get out of your CPU, the more beneficial this will be with more modern GPUs. And to be honest with you, if you're not running 3.5 at the very minimum, honestly, you really just need to upgrade your platform at this particular point. Okay, so why is it now? Why is this becoming an issue today? Of course, we're talking about higher refresh monitors, and this is becoming more mainstream. That's one of the reasons why this has come up. I recently upgraded from a 60 Hz 1080p panel to a 144 Hz 1080p panel. And it was at this point that I started noticing that, hey, my 4690K is not able to keep up with my GTX 970 all the time. It is a pretty decent CPU-GPU pairing, however, the graphics card will not be fully utilized at certain parts in certain games. So that's what started this for me, but why is this becoming a real issue? Like I said, it's becoming more mainstream to go for a higher refresh rate. But as I said, this is starting to become the big thing. The best monitors in the world now are all over 60 Hz. Take a look at your ROG Swift monitors. You have the 144 Hz version at 1440p, and then you have the IPS 165 Hz panel from ASUS. The Acer X34 Predator monitor, probably widely considered the best gaming monitor out today, is a 34-inch ultra-wide panel that runs at 100 Hz. So you're clearly going to want to achieve well over 60 frames per second to utilize these higher refresh rates. Otherwise, there's really no reason to buy these panels in the first place. If you're okay with 60 Hz and 60 frames per second, don't waste your money on these things. I know a lot of people out there have these panels and they're like, well, 60 Hz is fine for me. Well, honestly, you just wasted a crap ton of money then, because these are very, very expensive monitors. However, 1080p 144 Hz monitors are very reasonable. I got mine for $180. It's a 24-inch ASUS 144 hertz panel, no FreeSync, no G-Sync, no none of that nonsense, which honestly you don't really need at these refresh rates. Screen tearing is kept to a minimum because of the high refresh, and as long as you are over 100 frames per second, honestly, I don't see any screen tearing at all. It's when you start dipping below 100 frames per second that it becomes a bit of an issue. And since there's no V-Sync, no FreeSync, no G-Sync, no none of that crap on, response times are fantastic, pinpoint accurate. It's so much better than running with any of those sort of vertical syncs on. I know G-Sync and FreeSync is supposed to be, pretty comparable to running without VSync completely disabled, and I haven't been able to test that, so that may be a superior solution. However, this is a more cost-effective solution. And considering we are mostly cost-effective gamers, and some of you guys out there don't care about money, but most of us do, and that kind of puts the 1080p 144 at a pretty nice sweet spot right now. Okay, so why now? Why is this becoming such an issue today? The reason for this is, look at your consoles. Last generation, the Xbox 360 had a 3-core, 6-thread PowerPC CPU running at 3.2 gigahertz. Your PlayStation 3 had an 8-core IBM Cell processor also running at 3.2 gigahertz. Now, the Cell processor, although it was an 8-core, did not operate like our current 8 cores today. One core was a general purpose processor, which is what we have in our PCs right now. Every core we have is general purpose, and that all 3 of the cores on the Xbox 360 were general purpose, and then the other 7 cores were specific purpose processors. We can go into deep details about that, but it is not the same thing as a current 8-core processor, as each thread on there had to be specifically tasked, and this is why everybody hated programming for the PlayStation 3. In all honesty, the PlayStation 3 probably even kept back the Xbox 360 because programmers did not want to utilize those specific core processors. It was just a pain in the ass, and besides first-party devs, nobody wanted to mess with it. So most games kept it to a single core and a single thread if they could. Now, some games that wasn't possible, and they did branch out, especially utilizing the extra power on the Xbox 360 and PCs at the time. But for the most part, during the generation, a dual-core processor was adequate, so all games from 2005 through 2013, for the most part, were just fine on a dual-core, and at most, you really needed a quad-core. There was generally no benefit to going to an 8-core or a 4-core and 8-thread CPU. There are a couple exceptions out there, Crysis 3 being the most notable one, but besides that, there really wasn't a single game in that time span that really utilized more than 4 cores. And that's because of the console limitations. Now, after 2013, consoles actually had real 8-core CPUs. Even still, you're now using 8 slower cores. So games are being programmed with 8 slower cores in mind. So where at this point in time, pre-Xbox One and PS4, the Core i5 was the sweet spot. You could get greater than or equal to performance to the day's high-end Core i7s for $200 at the Core i5 price point. And a lot of people just don't realize that this is no longer the case. The Core i5 is no longer the sweet spot. Any CPU not utilizing 8 threads is not going to be able to keep up with today's games, as these games are designed with 8 cores in mind. Okay guys, to prove this, I went ahead and started doing some benchmarks, so we're going to go ahead and take a look at Witcher 3 here first. Okay, so as you can see on the graph, in Witcher 3, at the GTX 670, you see flat across the board. This is because the game is completely GPU limited with the GTX 670. So there's no performance gain with a faster CPU. If you look at the red bars, we're now looking at the GTX 970. And there's a little bit of fluctuation there. The Core i7s do see a little bit of an increase, but it's not that big of a deal over the Core i5s. That's because, for the most part, Witcher 3 is still GPU limited, but there are instances where it does hit CPU limitations. That's why you do see some minor gains, especially on the 4 GHz i7 versus, let's say, the 3.5 GHz i5. Obviously, that's a pretty substantial gain there. However, you are talking about doubling your thread count and a 500 megahertz overclock to get there. But that's a pretty substantial gain even on a GTX 970. Now moving on to the GTX 1070, where we are completely CPU bound, we see almost no gains on the Core i5 at 3.5 gigahertz. It's virtually no difference there. You do see a gain on the Core i7 at 3.5 gigahertz from 66 up to 77 frames per second. Okay, so that's not a massive jump, but you do see some gains there. Now moving on to the Core i5, 4 gigahertz, it's kind of the same story. You go from 63 frames per second to 66. Not really a big difference there. Going to the Core i7, 4 gigahertz, you go from 69 frames per second to 84 frames per second. That's a pretty big jump. What this means is the Core i5, for the most part, is completely bottlenecking even the GTX 970. That's basically the maximum that the Core i5 can handle, pretty much regardless of how fast it is, either 3.5 or 4 gigahertz. Now, the extra threads on the Core i7 is offering a substantial boost in performance, as seen in the chart right here. Next up, we're going to check out Crysis 3. Now, Crysis 3 is kind of similar to Witcher 3, but it is an older title. And like I said before, Crysis 3 was the first game to really utilize more than 4 threads. Now, it really does work well on Core i5s, as everybody has seen throughout the years, but it does utilize a little bit more from the Core i7s. But once again, we see with the GTX 670, it's flat across the board, 75 frames per second average across the board. Does not matter because you are 100% GPU bound. Now moving on to the GTX 970, it's almost the same story. We're pretty much flat across the board, except for the Core i5 at 3.5 gigahertz. That is a little bit slow, but for the most part, at 4 gigahertz and beyond, I mean, the Core i7 and the Core i5 pretty much flat. So for the most part, you're not so much CPU bound, just a little bit maybe, because the Core i7 4 gigahertz is it's a little bit higher. It's about 4% higher, but nothing too crazy there. Jumping up to the GTX 1070, this is where we see another decent jump, but we are still way CPU limited on this particular benchmark. As before with the GTX 970, the Core i5 at 3.5 gigahertz is substantially behind both the i7 at 3.5 gigahertz, the i5 at 4 gigahertz, and the i7 at 4 gigahertz. Now, the i7 at 3.5 gigahertz is actually superior to the Core i5 at 4 gigahertz. This really shows where those extra threads really come in handy when you have a GPU that is just far more powerful than the system is meant to handle. But the i5 at 4 GHz keeps up pretty well with the slower i7, so it's not a massive jump. Now, once you go to the Core i7 at 4 GHz, you do see a pretty substantial jump going from 117 frames per second on the i5 up to 132 frames per second. This is a pretty decent boost. Once again, like I said, the i7 here is completely bottlenecked for most of the time. However, there are many parts where it does free up enough resources where GPU utilization just as a whole is higher, whereas the i5 just sits at 100% utilization the whole time except for a few moments, and the GPU utilization is just substantially lower. Now we're going to go ahead and check out Doom. Doom is a very GPU limited game. This game runs very well on older CPUs. It just really requires the fastest GPU it can get its hands on. The first thing that you're going to notice is the i5s actually, on average, performed better than the i7s. This is because the extra thread performance from the i7s really isn't necessary. And honestly, it's mostly because the game's trying to spread out its code to the extra threads that I think's actually slowing it down, whereas on the i5s, it's 4 actual cores, and it's just more streamlined because it is not a CPU-limited game. But what's very interesting is, if you're looking at this graph here, you'll notice that the GTX 970 actually outperforms the GTX 1070 at certain parts. Now, Doom is one of those games where the CPU is really not the limitation. Obviously, the i5 is superior, and obviously GPU can't be the limitation because a 1070 is much more powerful than a GTX 970. So Doom is actually limited by another piece of equipment in your system, and this is the RAM. We went ahead and tested this in one of our other videos, where switching from DDR3 1600 to DDR3 2400 makes all the difference in the world. So for really high frames per second on Doom, you're going to need a system with faster RAM. Otherwise, you will see no performance gain from a faster CPU nor a faster GPU. As you can tell, the 970 should not be matching or beating a GTX 1070, but due to the fact that we're only running DDR3 1600, that is the reason why. Now, why are we only running DDR3 1600? I did not mention this before. It is because the first-gen Core series does not like to overclock with faster RAM. I tried to get it to run with 2133 or 2 gigahertz, and it would just become horribly unstable at any overclock. So for benchmarking purposes, I left it at 1600 across the board. Now that we've proved that Doom is very well optimized for CPU and obviously uses GPU utilization to its max, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these benchmarks compared to a newer architecture. So I went ahead and tested the GTX 1070 with my 4690K, and let's see how it compares to the first-gen Core series. So let's go back and start with Witcher 3 again. As you can see here, the Core i5 4690K at 4.4 gigahertz, which is what I run my system at normally, just completely dominates the other CPUs there. So don't even really look at the Core i7s, because we're trying to compare Core i5s to i5s, and we're looking at nearly a 50% boost over the 4 gigahertz Core i5 first gen. This is a big deal because a lot of people will tell you that older Core series CPUs, it doesn't matter, they're just fine. This right here is showing you that no, it's not. The architectural changes over time have yielded significant benefits, as this Core i5 is outperforming a first-gen Core i7 handedly. Now let's check out Crysis 3. Now on Crysis 3, it's kind of the same thing. There's a huge delta between the first-gen Core i5 at 4 GHz and the 4690K at 4.4 GHz. Yes, that is 10% faster on clock speed, but we're looking at about a 25% increase in frames per second. What's interesting is the first-gen Core i7 isn't too terribly far off from the Core i5 4690K. This means the benefit from a Core i7 over a Core i5 is pretty damn substantial. And then moving on to Doom, where we said that memory is more of the issue. Now look at this. Clearly, that is a major factor. 4690K that I was running with DDR3 2400 MHz memory. You can clearly see that the faster memory and the newer architecture yield significant performance gains over the older architectures. Whereas the older platforms cannot come close to hitting that coveted 144 frames per second average that we're looking for, the Core i5 4690K can. Now, what about some other benchmarks? Those are the only 3 benchmarks I'm really going to focus on here today, because I found out something was pretty interesting with Rise of the Tomb Raider. I'm going to go ahead and put up the graph that I went ahead and attempted to build for you guys. But besides the Core i5 running at 4 gigahertz, even my Core i5 4690K was throwing up some serious errors in benchmarking. It was outperforming the Core i7s by substantial margins, and I couldn't really figure out why. So I delved into it and I watched the benchmark, and then I noticed this. As you can see on the video in front of you, there's serious pop-in going on. So that means the benchmark is running without all the geometry on the screen. So this is inflating the benchmarks on the Core i5s as it's not rendering everything. This is a major issue, and I removed every benchmark that did this, including the 4690K. I did not include it. Now, the Core i5 at 4 gigahertz with the GTX 970, that performed just fine. I watched it and I made sure it did not have any of the weird pop-in, and I made sure to run each of these benchmarks 3 times, and then I came up with an average of the 3. So this way I know that they're clean and accurate. Alrighty guys, so that's it for the benchmarks. What does this tell us? What this shows us is older CPUs and GPUs are not completely useless. However, there's no reason to go ahead and pair them with a GPU that is just so overpowerful that they cannot be utilized properly. What I'm saying by this is you should not be pairing a GTX 1070 with a first-gen Core i7. Now, it's not a bad idea if you want to go ahead and upgrade your GPU first and gain some benefits now, and then upgrade your CPU and platform later. That's fine. As you can see from the benchmarks, you will see some benefit to the faster graphics card. However, as you've noticed, just going to my i5 4690K, there are substantial performance benefits that you are not utilizing by using such old hardware. There's a lot more performance in that graphics card that you're just not going to be able to tap into. So if you're thinking you're just going to pop in a GTX 1070, and if you already have something like a GTX 970, you're going to see very little performance gain as a whole. Now, games like Doom, that's really not too big of an issue. And like I said, guys, the reason to identify these bottlenecks is just to make sure that you don't pair an overpowerful graphics card with too weak of a CPU. Now, if you bought a CPU that's overpowered and a weaker GPU, that's fine, because you're more than likely going to upgrade that graphics card more often than you will that processor. Or I would hope so anyway. Now, some people like to upgrade their whole system at the same time, and that's okay too. But a lot of people will usually keep the platform and then just upgrade graphics cards as time goes on. Well, alrighty guys, I hope you found this video helpful. I'm sorry that it got a little bit long here, but I really hope this helps you guys identify what you should be looking for when buying your computer parts. You know, you don't listen to these guys out there that are of the mindset that, hey, it doesn't matter what your CPU is, any Core i whatever in the past 6 or 7 years would be just fine. Well, I just proved that that's not really the case. However, you can see some performance improvements. You're not getting your full value out of it. So I would ignore those people that tell you you're completely okay. Now, if you're running an older processor that cannot overclock, if you're running stock speeds and pretty much anything under 3.5, 3.6 gigahertz, just upgrade. You need to upgrade that. That is just too slow. I'm sorry. Now, if you have a K series and you can overclock, this buys you a lot more time. Well, alrighty guys, I hope this video was helpful. If you guys have any questions, please comment below. If you guys like the video, please like. And if you like what we're doing here, please subscribe. I'd really love to get more of these videos out. I'm going to be shooting for a 2600K, and we're going to see how that performs. And, you know, just kind of see how the 2500K and 2600K would compete with a GTX 1070 and see if it's even worth it. If you guys would really like to support us here and we can get more of these videos out for you, please click the card above, and we really appreciate any donations that you guys make. That helps us get the hardware so we can test it. This was a pretty substantial investment from me. I bought the graphics card. Like I said, I won a contest. I bought the graphics card myself. I bought the 1156 motherboard and processor. I paid for all this out of pocket just so I can bring these videos to you guys. So if you'd like to help us out, we can do this more often and get them out faster to you guys. But alrighty guys, hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you guys in the comments section.